Let me introduce myself. I'm Pastor Colin Dunn, and this is my final day in Goroka after 40 years association with Adventist Aviation Services, not continual. I was a Brisbane boy and started my apprenticeship in aviation with Ansett Airlines back in 1963, so that makes 60 years in the industry. But I didn't come from an Adventist home. My mum was an Adventist, but because of divorces I was never raised an Adventist. I had a number of different contracts. I worked overseas in aviation in a number of countries. And it wasn't until I met the Lord in 1977 when I was finally flight engineering on the Boeings with Ansett Airlines, and that I realised that there was more in life than making a reputation, making money. And so I resigned from my work because the Sabbath and airline work are not compatible. You're just a number. And that was September 1977 that I was baptised in the Coburg Church in Melbourne. I thought I'd close my toolbox forever. I went colporteuring for a year, and the Lord laid it on me very heavily that He wanted me to move into ministry. And so in 1979 I commenced my theology training at Avondale College. But at Avondale College they had a flying school and they wanted an engineer. I didn't find packing Weet-Bix a very fulfilling career to make money, because in those days there was no assistance for theology students, so you had to make your own money while you were studying. And so I, with Hans Abley, the very first engineer here from Adventist Aviation, started an aviation maintenance workshop at Avondale College Flying School, which helped pay my fees and get me through college. I was doing a double degree, but 5 years into the process, Colin Winch, who was one of the founding pilots, came to me, and because it was illegal for anyone to call someone out of college until they'd finished their education, his question was, do you know where I can find an aircraft engineer to go to Papua New Guinea? I knew exactly what he was asking. So I went home and discussed it with my wife, and I said, well, I haven't finished either degree, but I'm fed up with study. And so I said to Colin Winch, if you want a pastor pilot engineer, I know where I can find one. He said, well, put an application in. And that was the beginning of my career here. Following year, 1984, January 1st, I walked into this hangar in which we're sitting right now. And at that point in time, the aviation program had wound back to only one aircraft, Sierra Delta Charlie. The very first service I did was found 3 cracked pots on the Continental IO 520 engine, and that was the first time that I'd actually had to do a full service on a piston engine aircraft with as my licence was actually new, because I had to study for that licence while I was at Avondale College as well. And so that was sort of a baptism by fire, but it was a privilege. I felt I was home. My wife and myself and my children, we had committed to ministry for the whole of our life. We'd never expected to go back to Australia. But after 7 years here, the church needs had changed, the nationalisation program had come in, the country's permit systems had changed, and so we found ourselves moving to full-time ministry in New Zealand. Since I first commenced here, AAS has gone through a complete metamorphosis in change. It's nothing like what it used to be. Originally, the aircraft was the car for the district directors. And so the aircraft would only turn up here in the hangar when a service was due or there was an unserviceability to be fixed. I was the only person in the hangar with one lad who helped me, Rennie O'O. And every time the aircraft came in, the pilot who came in, he worked with me and while we did the servicing, and then they flew the aircraft out the end of the day. It was a completely private operation. There was no outside work for other companies. And the aircraft would be allocated a year in advance to what mission field it would go to. So it would go to Western Highlands for 3 weeks, and they would use it to do their ministry. Then it would move to SEEP for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it would move to Morribee. And so the aircraft was rotated around the field so that all of the fields had access to their rural churches and their rural communities. Not all missions had pilots, so sometimes a pilot like myself who didn't have a field, I would then do the flying for those mission fields that didn't have district directors. And so it was a private operation run purely by pastors and a couple of teachers at different times. They were paid for as pastors and teachers, so there was no expense to the aviation program for them, which meant we could run a very economical program. 1984, so first year that I started work here in the hangar, was the beginning of PAC, Pacific Adventist College. And Pacific Adventist College was being built down in Moresby specifically to bring the national pastors up to a level where they could actually take over from the expat district directors, administrators, presidents and what have you. Because the main job of a missionary is actually to do himself out of a job. We're here to hand the work on to others so that the field can be serviced and ministered to by people who understand the field best. And by 1987, it had become obvious that a change had to happen because all of the pilots that we had were all self-trained. They all paid for their own licenses, got themselves up to speed. And even though we ran as a commercial operation in our standards, we had yearly meetings, we had flight checks and training, which Colin was the chief pilot, then based in SPD in Sydney. The church spent nothing on getting pilots trained. The church did commit to giving upgrading and keeping the currency going for the pilots who are here. As the district directors were nationalised, we knew that the national pilots didn't have the ability to pay for getting pilot licences, which would have required going to Australia for 6 months and a lot of study. And it was very obvious that the pastor-pilot district director model was no longer going to work. And so AAS had to, for 2 years, study through how was the aviation going to continue without the pastor expat pilots, which had been staffing it up to that point in time. There was only one conclusion. We had to go semi-commercial. A lot of opposition to that because our church has always been opposed to using our institutions for commercial income. It goes back to the policy of a pastor's not allowed to have another job. He is dedicated to spreading the gospel, therefore he should be doing that full time. He's paid by tithe, he's paid a reasonable wage, so their time should not be broken up by secular activity. And a number of people actually applied that same policy to aircraft and ships, which was actually one of the reasons we lost all our ships, because they couldn't do commercial work with them, and we couldn't afford to maintain them. But the decision was made through the GC and the SPD and the PNGUM that we had to change over to a professional pilot model rather than the pastor pilot model. And the first pilot we employed, his name was Chris Cavilla, a very young-looking young pilot. All the people in the district here used to call him Piccaninny pilot because he looked so young. And our first income was from Karamui Spice. It was a cardamom company. We purchased their aircraft because their pilot was leaving and they couldn't maintain their aircraft. And we employed Chris. And so we had a permanent contract to move cardamom in and out of Karamui. And from there we started to build the whole operation up to servicing wherever it needed to be serviced. So now it's a purely professional pilot organisation. Fortunately now we're nationalising in those areas as well. And the church has no budget for flying for the different districts and missions. And so the job is for AAS to create enough funds to be able to give that to the PNGUM so that they can share that out amongst the missions so they can afford to charter the aircraft to do their flying. At the moment, I think our base cost for flying is 4,000 kina an hour. We operate for the missions at 1,500 kina an hour. Our commercial rate, if you're hiring us, is 6,000 kina an hour. And that's got to cover all the overheads, of course, of running the complete hangar, 23 permanent staff, 17 security staff. And so it's a big operation compared to what it used to be. The mission statement for AAS has never changed right from the very beginning, except for the commercial section. Our primary objective is to serve the church, to make aviation available to the rural areas. And the second part of that was to be available to the community. Even when we were a private operation, we would run emergency flights for sick folk. We looked after our clinics, our schools and that sort of thing. Rural development wasn't actually part of the model as far as the flying goes, but it was part of the model as we used to look after the strips. We'd send lawnmowers out to the strips. We'd make sure they're all cut and maintained, that they had the windsocks. We actually built many strips from the Sepik Western Highlands here in Eastern Highlands. And so the rural development at that stage was providing facility for them to be able to use aviation. Where now it is actually being the aviation program that brings in their produce so they can sell it at market, which allows them to create their tithe, create their school fees, to have the money they need to function in a more modern society. But we still continue to provide Medivacs free of charge to people through donations that are sent in. And occasionally we get a government grant to help us with our flying program. That's very minimal, but it's always appreciated. If you don't know your mission statement, you don't know your job. It's as simple as that. We're here for a purpose, and the vision is to show the love of God through the aviation program. And our current mission statement is to serve the church, serve the community. They're the two simple legs of it. And inside that is to work with development, work with medical facilities. Yes, going back to what I've already said, I walked into here on the 1st of January 1984, and I fully expected to be here until the day I retired. And so I didn't expect to actually leave. But I regarded it as a privilege, the fact that my first day in ministry in Papua New Guinea was here with aviation, and my last day in ministry here, even though I'm a volunteer now, is in aviation. So in some ways, I fulfilled that dream. The single biggest challenge we have is staffing. Because the aviation industry is a 7-day industry, Papua New Guinea people in aviation have a tremendous problem getting into the aviation. The PNG national folk haven't had a long history in aviation, so there's not a lot of people who are Seventh-day Adventists, because it's hard to be in aviation as a Seventh-day Adventist, who've got the experience and background to do the job that needs to be done. And so we're still dependent in certain areas on expats, and it's getting harder and harder as the concept of mission decreases in the Western world to find young people who are prepared to come, and as particularly senior people who are prepared to come who can keep up the level of proficiency and safety that's required. So staffing is our number one issue. Mission aviation is a hard call. The word mission implies there are difficulties, there are shortfalls. Otherwise they wouldn't be mission, they'd be developed countries. And so the major issue with mission is that some people come here expecting to have air conditioning and a nice car and a nice house, and to be able to work a 40-hour a week and go home and have their weekends off. But mission is not like that. Mission is being prepared to go where you don't want to go, prepared to do things that you don't want to do. It's much better if you want to do that in the first place. But it calls for flexibility, it calls for tenacity. It's very frustrating at times, but it's also very fulfilling at times. Something that doesn't have a challenge isn't rewarding. And mission definitely has its challenges. We won't always say that they're always rewarding, but mission is hard. And God doesn't ever seem to give us a budget in advance. We always seem to be running short of money. We always seem to be scratching around to get what we want. And he always seems to make us rely on faith to fulfill the work he's given us. And so it takes quite a heavy commitment of faith to continue to work with mission aviation. And that's the wrong statement. But around the world, because aviation is so hard that nearly all the church programs around the world have collapsed. We still have one over in Irian Jaya, and we're the second one. But because of the demands of staffing, because of the demands of insurance and the costs, because the world is providing better services by comparison, mission aviation struggles. Last Sabbath I was at one of the churches I used to pastor here up in the valley, and one of the old elders I used to work with, he came up to me and said in Pidgin, I won't say it in Pidgin, but Pastor, it's remarkable. You look exactly the same as you did 40 years ago. Now, I know he's making a comment, but I think, truly? I looked this decrepit 40 years ago? While I said that mission can be hard, it is hard. It's also extremely rewarding. And my experience is that when you're on the cusp of evangelism, when you're working in the front line, which aviation has been right through all these years, you see God's hands working in quite a special way. I can remember one instance, there's many stories I could tell, but I had been out flying for about a week and I was returning back to Goroka, and I got a call for a medevac. And I can't remember the name of the strip. It was over the other side of Mount Michael, which is behind us. It was quite a difficult strip, and normally we fly in 3 different times with an experienced pilot in command under supervision in 3 different weather conditions to make sure we know how to handle the strip. But when it's a medevac, you're allowed to kill yourself without doing any practice runs. This particular strip was on a ridge down in a valley, and it was fairly flat on top with a sharp curve at the end of it, and the only way you could pull up was to get down to the bottom of the rising section and use that to wash off your speed before you got to the flat section. My problem was you normally come around at 1,500 feet, but the mountain ridge that was above the strip was 1,000 feet above the strip. And I tried to maintain clearance instead of coming down to 500 feet above the trees. And so when I turned final, by the time I got down to the strip where I should have been at 39 knots, I was actually at 80 knots. And the strip looked beautiful, but so I dumped the flaps, I killed the engine, I missed the rise, I got on the flat spot, and as soon as I hit the flat spot, the whole windscreen went brown with mud. The grass on the strip was about 6 inches long and it was 4 inches full of water, and I aquaplaned. And the aircraft was heading straight to the trees at the end of the strip. And I can remember saying to the Lord, it's your aircraft, if you want it, you're going to have to do something with it. And I hit the brakes, which was useless because I was aquaplaning, and I went full rudder and full throttle to try and swing the aircraft around. Nothing happened, it kept aquaplaning. And I just said that one word prayer, help, and the aircraft stopped. It stopped so fast that I had bruising over both shoulders from where the safety straps were, the harness was holding me into the aircraft. And I actually got out of the aircraft, my knees were like jelly, and I walked along the leading edge of the wing to see if I could see angel handprints in the wings. God pulled that aircraft up like that. Because otherwise it would have been still sitting there broken up in the trees at the end of that strip. So people say, you know, amazing, how did you survive flying up in New Guinea for 7 years? I was, angels. Nothing special about my piloting, angels. My motivation at the time was that AAS looked like closing. I was here from 2013 to 2015, and I trained a lady to take over QSM, but they, at the end of their contract, I think it was before the end of their contract, they decided they needed to go back to America, and they had no one to take over the QSM department. And so I think it was Lan Harvey got in contact with me and asked me whether I'd come back again. And I expected to come back for a year or two, but here we are, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 years. But now we have got someone who can replace me. And I'm very sad to be going, but at 77, I'm very happy to be going too, because the body's not what it used to be, and nor is the mind. I'm actually no longer safe because my memory doesn't work the way it should anymore. But the reason I came back was you cannot legally run an aviation program without a quality and safety manager, and there are very few people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church who've got that experience. I'm one of those people, so it's my job to make it available to the Lord. One thing I have been blessed with all the way through is my wife has shared the same vision of serving in mission, or whether it's pastoral work or whether it's aviation work, and she's always stood beside me. My wife has never taken a full-time job. She's always been there for me. She's always gone with me on visitation in the churches. And in Papua New Guinea, of course, we had our children for her to raise. And my wife doesn't object to me leaving home and coming up to Papua New Guinea in the slightest bit. She's quite an independent lady. She uses the time to go and visit our daughter or her sisters. And it would be useless for her coming up here because she's not allowed to have a work permit. She doesn't have a family to look after, and she has to be sitting in the house twiddling her thumbs doing crosswords for a month at a time. And so she's totally supportive of my coming. She's very happy to see me home. And sometimes I think she might be happy to see me go too. AAS at the moment is struggling because of staffing issues and financial issues and the outcome of the loss of all our reserves during the COVID flying shutdown. We've just sold one aircraft. We're going back to 2 aircraft operations so that we can continue to fund the aviation program. So my simple vision is the original vision, that we be back at 3 aircraft, flying about 1,200 hours a year minimum, with enough budget to give the union the money they need for all the missions to do the outreach work of the church. For young people who are wishing to get into the aviation, mission aviation program, it's not an easy road because the Seventh-day Sabbath interferes with the training program, and it makes it hard to get the base experience. It takes hard work, it takes diligence, and it takes faith to stick with it. The thing I'd say is most important is a commitment to mission aviation. 90% of the young pilots we get here are only looking for a way to get between their 250 and 300 hours and get up to the 1,000 hours where they're employable by other companies, bigger companies, and then they leave us. And it takes us 2 years to get a person trained and up to speed here, and quite often we only get them trained and up to speed and they're productive for a short time and they're moving on. But to get over that difficulty of how you get into aviation, my advice is commit yourself to lifetime mission aviation, and if that is the thing which is on your heart, God will actually get you through the initial training and into the program, because He wants people who can build up experience, who can move on from the initial piloting or engineering into administration and keep the place running in a professional way. So my advice is look at it as a calling, commit it to God, and He will bring you through it. If you look at it as a step up, you're never going to have the experience and the joy that it brings, and you're never going to see the fruit that full faith brings. There have been a number of difficult times, but the Bible text I fall back on is Jeremiah 29, 11, 12, where God says, I know the plans I have for you to prosper you. And that text, when I look at it, when I'm discouraged or when I can't see the way forward, always tells me that this is God's work, and if He wants to continue, He will always provide the answers. If God was to say, I no longer need this program, well then we're wasting our time no matter how hard we work, because man alone cannot maintain mission aviation flying. The devil doesn't want it, and it is an underdog in the aviation world. But that's my text, where God says, I know the plans I have for you. Like when I first came here, I believed I was here for life. I didn't know that God had a plan for me to go into full-time ministry and then end up back in aviation again. One thing we need is faith. God will show us the practice, what he wants us to do with that faith. Our job is just to stay faithful. After leaving the aviation program, I was called to South New Zealand conference to pick up pastoral work there in Timaru. The first experience was mission orientation problems, cultural orientation problems, because I actually started ministry in Papua New Guinea, where the local people are on fire for evangelism. Like here in my local church at Katuni in Gahuku, they'd come up to me and say, Pastor, it's 6 weeks since we had the last evangelistic program. When are we going to get fair income? And you go home to Australia and you say, okay, when are we getting into evangelism? Well, we're planning in 3 years' time. So I actually had a lot of difficulty adjusting. I can remember the first board meeting at Timaru. There were a number of lights in the church, and somehow one lampshade had been broken. And the whole evening was discussing whether we're going to buy new lampshades for the whole place or whether we're going to try and get a matching one. And in the end of it, I lost them. I said, your lampshade doesn't matter one iota. It's not going to save a single soul. And eventually one of the little old, a lady elder, not a little old, well she was, said to me, Pastor, I think we've still got one of the original ones in my shed at our place and it fixed it. So orientating into it, but one experience I had, which it took over a period of time to happen, but I was working at Oberon in South New South Wales, and one of the ladies there, Georgia, had 3 lovely daughters, and they were all very faithful church members. The husband, Doug, he was a man's man. He was a builder, a farmer. He was a pig shooter that used to do pig eradication around the national parks. And he encouraged his wife in her faith. He paid for all his kids to go to Adventist schools, but he wasn't interested in the slightest in spiritual things. Anyway, Doug got cancer. And it got worse. The doctors didn't have an answer for it. And Georgia said to her husband, would you consider having our pastor come around and anoint you? At this stage, he couldn't sleep and the pain was terrible. And he said, I don't care who you get around here if they can help, bring them. And so I went around, I dispensed with the normal Bible study and things you do with people before you anointed them, because I knew that was a waste of time. And I said to Doug, listen, what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the Lord to intervene on your behalf to solve your problem. To do that, I've got to put the symbol of the Holy Spirit on you for the anointing with oil. Are you comfortable with that? He said, yeah, just get over and done with it. So I had a quick prayer. I actually had to follow him around the room because he wouldn't stop walking because of the pain. And I anointed him and had a prayer with the whole family and went home. And you're almost scared to ring the next day after anointing to see whether anything's happened or not, because quite often the Lord's healing is one of spiritual healing rather than physical healing. But I rang the next day and they said, Doug's had the first night's sleep he's had for months. And I moved on. I was called about 3 months later. I was moved on and I heard no more about it. I ran into Georgia at a camp meeting, must be 10 years later. I said, how's Doug? She said, he's totally healed. No doctors. God moved slowly with him. And as God healed, his faith grew and he's a baptized member today. So if you want adventure, get into ministry. As I said, the role of a missionary is to do himself out of a job. And so the final thought is that it's a prayer, it's a wish, it's a hope, is that Adventist Aviation will attract the national staff who can take over the full leadership, who are full-time, who live in country and can give it stability and direction and safety and productivity. And so it's more of a dream and a goal rather than a final thought. All through your life, God gives you little touchstones. You don't have to prove Christianity. Christ proves himself. And so you move from appreciating and being amazed by the Bible prophecies, seeing that the Bible represents how the world works and it's the best way to interpret the world, from getting standards of how you can best live your life, onto a relationship with God where he does personal things for you. And then after you've had those experiences, you don't have to rely on everything else because you know it's for real. Christianity works. And when I was coming into the church, I understood Christianity because I had been raised from the age of 4 until 8 by Seventh-day Adventist grandparents on Norfolk Island. And I think I'd always believed in God, even though I had all sorts of weird beliefs. 6 months before being baptised, I thought I had every answer to why Christianity was irrelevant, and they're all irrelevant answers. I knew that I wasn't the father I ought to be, and I wasn't the husband I ought to be, and so I started praying about that. In the process, I met a friend of mine who had been an engineer with me in Africa, Doug his name is, and he had gone from being a fairly rough, swearing, heavy drinking character, where I used to go shooting with him, to being a very stable, non-swearing, non-drinking, totally different person. He'd left engineering, he'd gone into growing gladiolis actually, to get a better lifestyle. And I was impressed by the change he's made. Now, he'd become a Jehovah's Witness, well, that meant nothing to me. And when I was flying with Ansett Airlines, we'd fly to Perth where he was, and often we'd have a day and a half layover because of duty time. And I went out and visited him. And in that process, Pauline, his wife, said to me, "I didn't answer your Christmas card." I said, "So, I don't mind." She said, "Well, there's a reason for it," and she started to explain her faith. And when I got back to Melbourne, where I was based with Ansett Airlines, I started talking to my wife. My wife had always been a believer, Methodist background, but with a heathen like me, she wasn't practicing. So we started to talk things through. To Maureen's disgust, because she knew what Jehovah's Witnesses taught and believed, so she wasn't too impressed. I invited them into the house for studies. I didn't know a lot about my Bible, but we got to one stage where the subject of grace and law came up. I knew about the Sabbath because of my mother and my grandparents, and as an engineer, I knew that you can't do away with law. Law is law. And when someone says to me, "We're saved by grace, not by law, the 10 Commandments are irrelevant," I said to myself, no, in engineering, in physics, law is never irrelevant. You don't change law. And if it's God's law, it doesn't change. And so we said goodbye to those folk, and God worked 2 miracles. One, I was actually being retrained from the Boeing 727 to the Lockheed Electras. And for 6 months, on full wages, I think I only flew about 3 or 4 weeks in the 6 months. There would be a pilot strike, then there'd be a fuel strike, then my trainer would be sick. And so Maury and I had 6 months virtually to sit down and study grace and law. And we were convicted by the end of that time that what's the use of grace if you haven't got law? There's nothing to forgive. And so the two had to go together. The last thing in the world I wanted to be was a Seventh-day Adventist, because I remember as a young kid we'd leave the farm at 8 o'clock in the morning to go to church, and we'd get back at 8 o'clock at night, because you went to Sabbath school, you went to main church, you had lunch together, you had AYs, you stayed for closing Sabbath Vespers, and then you had a social evening. And to me that was over the top, and I didn't want to go back to that sort of style. And the second thing was, they were vegetarians, and my grandmother used to feed me on sweet potato leaves. And anyone who understands sweet potato leaves, they're not the nicest vegetable in the world. And so as far as I was concerned, there were people who spent the whole Sabbath at church and they ate grass. And so the last thing I wanted to be was a Seventh-day Adventist. My daughter at the time, Angela, was just in grade 1. She would have been 6 years old. And my half-brother, Louis, had given us Tiny Tots Library, which is a book for kids on Bible stories that the church used to produce. And in the back cover, there was a 2-page fold out of the 10 Commandments with a 4 table on one side and a 6 table on the other side. And our daughter came home from grade 1 and said to Maureen, "Why do you and Daddy only keep 9 commandments?" There's no way in the world she would have understood what adultery was and all those big words. And there's no way in the world she would have understood that we weren't keeping one. So we realised that at that point that God was saying to us, it is law, it is grace, it is the total law. And so we were left with, you should never say no choice, but we were left with no choice except to start studies with the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Melbourne.